like to turn it over to Susan Mundry, who is the facilitator for the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance, to kick off the webinar this afternoon.
Good afternoon, Peter, and good afternoon. During which we will report on and discuss findings from a review of performance-based teacher evaluation systems in 5 states that was done by the Regional Education Laboratory, Northeast and Islands, and just released earlier this year. The webinar is sponsored by the Regional Education Laboratory, which is led by EDC in partnership with American Institutes for Research and WestEd. And also, this webinar is co-sponsored by our friends at the New England Comprehensive Center that is led by RMC Research in partnership with Learning Innovations at WestEd. As Peter mentioned, I am the lead facilitator for our new initiative called the Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance. Its mission is very in line with the content of today's webinar, and we're hoping that this is just one of many gatherings that we offer through that new research alliance to bring current knowledge and information about I would like to review with you today's agenda. We will provide, as Peter mentioned, an overview of the findings on this recently released report, focusing especially on the teacher evaluation measures, the teaching standards the evaluations are designed to measure, and the rating categories used in 5 states that our researchers examined. Study co-author Julie Reardon and Karen Shakman will report findings and respond to your questions. So please feel comfortable posting all those questions in the chat, and we will pause from time to time to take some of those questions. Angela Minichi, we're delighted to have her join us from the National Comprehensive Center for Teacher Quality, and she'll be providing us with a national perspective. Educator evaluation is an extremely active area at the moment, with many of our districts and states working very hard to get new systems in place on very short timelines, and Angela will be updating us on the national scene, and then we will hear from 2 states. Martha Ann Todd from Georgia Department of Ed. Georgia is one of the states that was featured in Julie and Karen's report, and Martha will be giving us an update of where they are with their educator evaluation system. And of course, Carla Brooks-Bear from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education will update us on the activities that are happening in Massachusetts. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. Before we get into the program, I will provide just a slight light background on the Regional Education Laboratory for those of you who may not be familiar with it and maybe are just accessing some of our services for the first time. I think many of you are aware that the U.S. Department of Education funds a network of 10 educational laboratories across the country, and these entities called RELs serve the education needs of a region. The laboratories provide access to educational research through applied research studies, such as the one you'll hear about today, and related technical assistance activities. This regional laboratory serves the Northeast and Islands, which includes New England, New York, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. Our primary partners on the Regional Education Laboratory, as I mentioned earlier, is the lead agency is EDC, located in Waltham, Massachusetts, and the Learning Innovations at WestEd, which with offices both in Vermont and Massachusetts, and American Institutes of Research based in Washington. We are primarily really a hallmark of our new contract and our work this year is to build strong partnerships among educational practitioners, policymakers, and researchers. We're currently working with state and local education agencies and others across the region to develop and support what are called research alliances. And these alliances are addressing 4 of our major regional priorities that were identified as we put together our proposal for our new 5-year contract. These priorities are that we identify and retain effective teachers and principals, improve low-performing schools and districts, and work on ensuring equity and supporting special populations, and increasing college and career readiness, access, and completion. The REL is forming 8 of these research alliances to address these 4 major priority areas. The alliances will really be supported to develop capacity to use data that is available in the region or elsewhere and conduct and apply research to inform educational practice. The research alliance that is most associated with the topic of today's webinar, as I mentioned, is our new Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance. The goal of this particular alliance is to really focus in on providing research to support states and districts around as they build and implement their educator evaluation systems, and to support educators throughout the region to develop capacity to research and evaluate their own systems. So we look forward to inviting many of you on today's webinar to join us in this research alliance. We are just in the early stages of formulating the alliance, and we'll be reaching out to many of you as either members or definitely as sharing in the information that we'll be generating out of this work. So that's just that little background on our Regional Education Laboratory and our new research alliances. I would like to turn the program over to Dr. Julie Reardon of EDC. Julie is a co-author of the report we will hear about today, and Julie also oversees the Regional Education Laboratory's applied research and evaluation work. Julie?
Thanks, Susan, for that introduction. Well, we've designed this webinar to be interactive, and we hope that you will participate in 2 different ways. As Peter explained, there's a space on the left side of your screen for you to enter a question or a comment or observation, and we'll be monitoring this chat and responding as we go. We may push out web links in this chat that connects to related work. And the other way that we hope you'll participate is through our polls. We have a couple of places in our presentation where we'll pause for a poll of our participants. The poll will appear on your screen, and you can indicate your response during the polling period. So next, we will hear from Karen Shakman. Pardon me, skipped a little ahead, who will talk about the report featured in this webinar, an examination of performance-based teacher evaluation systems in 5 states. Okay, thank you, Karen. Go ahead.
Thank you, Julie. Hello, everyone. My name is Karen Shakman, and Julie Reardon and I were 2 of the authors on this report that was researched and written in the spring and summer of 2011. It examined the characteristics of state-level performance-based teacher evaluation systems that were fully operational in the 2010-11 school year. I'm going to take a few minutes to describe both the motivation for the report and some of our key findings. So first, why this study? Why did we decide to embark on this investigation? As many of you know, just within the Regional Ed Labs Northeast and Islands region, we have 3 states that are race to the top states. Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island are all developing and implementing new systems in a fairly rapid time frame. And other states within the region, including Maine, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, have also begun statewide efforts to reform their evaluation systems. As a result of all this activity, the REL has had many requests for information, particularly about what other states and districts might be doing related to educator evaluation. Also, recent research on teacher evaluation systems have highlighted the state of traditional teacher evaluation and the need for reform. They've generally argued that traditional teacher evaluations don't differentiate enough among the teachers. There's not enough differentiation, particularly in terms of systems that use these binary rating systems in which teachers receive an overall satisfactory or unsatisfactory rating. And in general, some of the research that's been conducted in the last several years has called for reform to the teacher evaluation systems to increase the rigor of them. And along with that, the Race to the Top federal grant competition certainly put an emphasis on reforming teacher evaluations and emphasized the need for more rigorous, transparent, and fair evaluation systems that differentiated effectiveness using multiple rating categories instead of this binary, and took into account student growth data. So this context at the federal level also reflected and informed a state policy context that in recent years states across the country and in the region have proposed major reforms to create comprehensive evaluation systems that have these multiple measures, multiple ratings of teacher performance. So all of these things together inspired us to embark on this work. So in order to do this, we had to define some criteria for inclusion in the study. We were looking to come up with a way to include states' systems, and we developed a set of selection criteria in order to embark on this work. So we drew from the Race to the Top guidelines and from research to define these criteria. And we had several iterations of the criteria. The final criteria were that the systems had to be required for all practicing general educators and not just for early career teachers or a subset of teachers within the state, that it be operational statewide. We were not looking at pilots or district level initiatives. We were looking at statewide operational teacher evaluation systems, so not proposed reforms, but existing systems. We were also looking at, as reflected both by research and by Race to the Top guidelines, that they employ multiple rating categories. So these are systems that don't use a simple satisfactory, unsatisfactory rating system, but use some more complicated set of scoring criteria. And then finally, that they employ multiple measures of teacher effectiveness. We were looking at systems that a lot of the research in particular focuses on the need for multiple ways to evaluate teacher effectiveness. And so we were looking for systems that included several measures. It's important to note that the Race to the Top guidelines for performance-based evaluation also call for systems to include student growth data as a significant factor and to require annual evaluations of teachers. However, when we began to look at what states had in place in the 2010-2011 school year, we were not able to find any states that had statewide implementation of student growth data at that point. And in addition, if we were to require annual evaluations as one of our final selection criteria, that would have eliminated several of the states that we did include. So we selected to remove that at this point. We also felt that that wasn't probably a critical element in terms of understanding how the systems operated. So using these selection criteria, we identified these two research questions to guide our work. First, we were looking at the key characteristics of state-level performance-based teacher evaluation systems, and also looking specifically at the teacher evaluation measures, that is observations, principal evaluation, artifacts, and so forth that the systems employed, the standards they were designed to measure, and the rating categories, these multiple rating categories that I talked about, and how the states use them to evaluate teachers. So for today's study, for today's presentation, the focus of my discussion of findings will be on these three areas: teacher evaluation measures, the teaching standards they were designed to measure, and how states employed these multiple rating categories in evaluating teachers. So how do we do this? We developed a systematic review of all 50 states' Department of Ed websites. We wanted to initiate a national scan, and so we employed the systematic search protocol for identifying states that had systems in place that matched the criteria I just described. And once we identified likely candidates, we then conducted a more thorough search, including a general online search. We gathered publicly available documents, including the evaluation guides or manuals that states put out, the formative and summative rubrics that they included, any training materials, any state regulations, any program reports, anything basically that we could find that was publicly available we looked at. And in addition, we contacted state. It is important to note at this point that our research consisted entirely of publicly available documents. There were no interviews, there were no observations of any kind that we conducted. We were drawing on only what we were able to identify from publicly available information. And finally, who was included? There were 5 states included in our final selection. Delaware and Tennessee both are Race to the Top Phase 1 winners. Georgia and North Carolina were Race to the Top Phase 2, and Texas did not apply for Race to the Top funding. So as you can see, this list reflects a diverse group of states. There were several other states that met some, but not all of our criteria. And again, the key factors for inclusion in the final set of states had to do with whether or not they employed a multiple rating system, so not just the satisfactory, unsatisfactory, that they have multiple measures, that the evaluation system be required for all educators rather than, for example, some of the states had systems in place, but they were only for beginning educators. And that really that they be a system rather than a set of regulations or guidelines. We were looking for fully operational systems that the state had developed. It is important to note before I move on that we developed this process for identifying states, and we're pretty confident that if we conducted the same process at this point in the spring of 2012, it would be a longer list than it was in the spring of 2011. It's a rapidly changing context these days. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about our findings. First, I'm going to talk a bit about what we found related to evaluation measures. Then I will talk about some of our findings related to the teaching standards the measures were designed to evaluate. And finally, I'll give a little bit of an overview of the multiple rating categories the states employed. So first, evaluation measures. We drew from Go, Bell, and Little's 2008 categorization of the types of measures that systems might employ. They include things like classroom observations, principal evaluations, and you can see the list here. And we used that as a vehicle for looking across the states at what kinds of measures they employed. And we made state systems. First, we changed principal evaluation to administrator evaluation. This is because as we looked across the systems, in many of them they did not indicate specifically that the principals conducted the written evaluation or the observations or the final written evaluations, but rather there may be an administrator who did the evaluation, and some it's a principal, so we wanted to leave that more open. And also we added a category based on what we found in the state's systems. We added the category of professional development and growth plans. And that's because several of the states that we looked at employed some type of professional growth or development plan either as a rated or unrated component of the evaluation system. So working with these 8 categories of measures, we looked closely at the 5 states and what measures they used and how they used them. So the next slide will provide an overview of that, and you can also find more information about that in the paper, which you can download directly from this presentation on your, I think it's your left-hand side. So taking a look at this chart here, I know it's small, but again, you can find this chart in the paper as well. Along the top, you'll see these measures. There are 8 measures listed along the top. Down the side, you'll see the 5 states, and a check indicates that the state system uses this type of measure as a rated component of the system. So teachers receive some sort of rating for the use of some sort of rating with this measure. As you can see from the chart, there are 3 evaluation measures that were used by all 5 states in our report. The first is observation of teacher practice. There's considerable variation about who observes, when the observations take place, and how often. And the report provides some more detail about what this variation looks like from state to state. In some cases, the variation is whether or not they're announced or unannounced observations. It's the number. In some cases, there's variation dependent on the number of years the teacher has been teaching. If it's a new teacher, there are more observations. So a more experienced teacher is observed less frequently. But you can see some of that both in the content of the report and in the appendices where we provide profiles of each of the states. In addition, administrator evaluations and self-reports of teachers' practice were employed in all 5 state systems. Only 3 states employ professional development or growth plans as a required and rated component of their evaluation systems. They use these as a rated component, and it's factored into the teacher's overall evaluation. In some cases, they may be used as a measure following an evaluation, so that teachers may be required to use a professional growth plan if their evaluation score was lower than is deemed to be satisfactory. But we only included this if it was a rated element of the evaluation system. Classroom artifacts were used in all 5 states in some way, but it was only Georgia that we found required evaluators themselves to collect artifacts for each of the teaching domains and assign a score based on the artifact to that domain. So that was the only state. While artifacts were certainly recommended or optional or suggested as additional evidence for teachers to include, Georgia was unique in that it included it as these artifacts as a rated component of the system. Finally, it's notable that none of the state systems we studied included either teaching portfolios or student ratings as elements of their evaluation systems. It's important to note, however, that with teaching portfolios, that's as a discrete component. There's certainly examples where states' systems suggested the submission of evidence, but not the submission of a fully developed teaching portfolio. No states at this point that we conducted the research included student ratings of teacher performance. And finally, value-added models or student growth scores were not in any of these systems as a statewide operational at the level of implementation. We did see evidence as we looked at the state websites of the intention to roll these types of things out, but we were again looking only at what was operational in the 2010-2011 school year. I think I'm going to turn it over to Julie now that I've given you a lot to chew on to ask a question.
Thanks, Karen. So yes, now I'd like to hear from you. You will see a poll question on your screen. I'll read it. What evaluation measures described in the report are of most interest to you in your school, district, or state context? You'll see the poll appear on the right-hand side, and if you can just, it'll move to the center, and you can just select one option. So select the feature that is of most interest to you in your own context. And it looks like value-added models was a first choice for some of you. And it's interesting to see classroom observations is also of interest. It's interesting because classroom observations are, I think, have been in place much longer. They've changed and evolved. Value-added models, however, are newer, right? And there's lots of questions about how to use them, design them, and integrate them in your teacher evaluation systems. Okay, so it looks like we have almost half of you folks here have an interest in the value-added models. I don't think that's surprising, given the push to include value-added models in teacher evaluation systems. Classroom observations looks like it's takes second place here, followed by analysis of classroom artifacts. Okay, this is very interesting. Thank you for participating. It makes it more interactive when we hear from you folks. Okay, so let's return to the presentation. Karen, go ahead.
Hi there. Okay, so that's great. We will hopefully be able to attend to some of what you've indicated that you're most interested in as we move along, and some of the other presenters will be able to talk about exactly what they're doing related to, for example, student growth or the use of observations. But to move on at this point, in addition to looking at the types of evaluation measures, we were actually very interested in the types of knowledge and skills these evaluation systems were designed to measure. So in other words, we wanted to understand what teaching standards these evaluation systems measured, and whether there might be some standards or some knowledge and skills that were more frequently measured and others that didn't show up as frequently. So we set about to analyze the summative rubrics that each of the state systems used, and these were based on their state's teacher standards. So we needed a way to look across the states and make comparisons from state to state in terms of these general bodies of knowledge and skill. So to do that, we drew on the Intasc Standards, and because they are they were developed in 1992 and they were recently revised in 2011. So they reflect some of the state's most current thinking about knowledge and skills for teaching. As you can see here, the standards are grouped into these 4 general categories. The bolded text are the 4 general categories, and beneath them there are 10 standards. So they group under these 4 general categories. This is very similar to what we found across the 5 states. There was certainly some variation from state to state in how they organized all of this, but specifically these standards really provided us with a general way of looking across all 5 states. So we were looking for this common language, and in order to do this, we used these 10 standards, so at the level of the 1, 2, 3, 4, the standards, to code all of the 5 states' summative rubrics, to try to understand what knowledge and skills were reflected most frequently, and was there anything that was missing, and what might be reflected but not as frequently in the summative evaluations. What we found, you see here in the numbers that I've included next to each of the standards, is this reflects each of the state systems. So you'll see, for example, number 1, learner development, 3 indicates that there were 3 state rubrics that reflected this body of knowledge and skill in the summative rubric for evaluating teachers. The main thing that I think you can gather from looking at this is that generally the state's rubrics reflect most of the knowledge and skills reflected in the Intasc Standards. So in general, the states are reflecting most of the general knowledge and skills in their rubrics in some way. More specifically, all 10 standards were reflected in the teacher evaluation rubrics in North Carolina and Texas. 9 were reflected in Georgia, and 8 in Delaware and Tennessee. One of the Intasc standards, this first one that I just pointed to about learner development, and this one is that specifying that teachers demonstrate an understanding of how students learn, was absent from 2 states' evaluation rubrics. And in fact, this standard was the least frequently identified standard in all states except Delaware. I hasten to say at this point that further research is definitely needed into this question about the types of knowledge and skills that the evaluations measured. It certainly raises interesting questions, but more needs to be done to capture what's in the rubrics, what might be missing, and also to look at what types of evaluation measures might measure what types of knowledge and skills. So we did this as a sort of an exploration, and we anticipate that this will be a fruitful body for further research down the road. I'm turning it over to Julie now to see what you think about that.
Okay, thanks, Karen. So, okay, let's hear from you again. So which of the Intasc teaching standards do you believe would be hardest to capture in a teacher evaluation system? You'll see, again, a poll that will display in the middle of your screen. You can select one option, and I can see people are thinking about this. What are challenging, what is difficult to capture in a teacher evaluation system? So we have learner development. Looks like I see some folks, let's see there, learner development and learner differences look like they may lead the pack in terms of teaching standards that are difficult to capture in evaluation. And not much about application of content or instructional strategies. So it's interesting. We'll see even this learner differences. The first 2, the learner development, learner differences, may sort of, especially learner development, reflects the finding from our report and something that I think would be worthy of future research. Thank you for voting. It looks like most of you have voted. So thank you. All right. Let us return back to the report. I think Karen is going to talk a little bit more about the rating categories in the states that we studied. Karen?
Thanks, Julie. This last poll, I think it's really interesting, before I move on, to think about not only overall what types of standards are hard to capture, but as you think about specific measures. So what types of knowledge and skills is the observation designed to measure versus what types of knowledge and skills might the collection of classroom artifacts measure. This definitely raised more questions for us than it answered, and we hope that this will be something that either we or somebody else can take up at some point. So my last bit is to talk a little bit about these multiple rating categories. A lot has been made of the lack of rigor of evaluation systems that use these binary rating scales in which teachers are simply judged satisfactory or unsatisfactory. Some research, and some very famous research, has shown that the overwhelming majority in these types of binary systems are rated as satisfactory, and that the new systems are really designed to capture more of the variation among teachers and their practice. So we were interested in, well, how is that done? If states are using multiple rating categories, how are they using them, and how do they arrive at a summative score for teachers? So what I have here is a chart that is in the report and provides more detail in the report than what I put here. And I think the basic takeaway when you look at this chart is that there are 5 states, and there are 5 very different ways to approach this question. So really what we took away, we provide in the report some information about how the different states are doing it, simply because it's interesting to look at the different ways that states approach this problem. But we weren't able to really say a lot in terms of summative about this, because really there are as many ways to do it as there were states in the report, and there are more states doing it more ways, and I think some of our discussants will talk about that as well. So if you're interested in a bit more detail about how these scores were determined, please do refer to the report, where we provide some of that detail within the content of the report, and some is in the appendices. So finally, my last bit is to tell you a little bit about the limitations of our study. There were several. Our study focused on state-level performance-based evaluation systems and not on district level. And as we all know, there are a lot of things going on at the district level. There are a lot of innovations occurring at the district level, and that's not captured in this report. It also was conducted in the school year of 2010-2011 and doesn't reflect the changes that have been taking place at a very rapid clip over the course of the last year. It was focused on teacher evaluations, not principal or administrator, although Race to the Top and much of the research that we read talks about educator evaluation as an inclusive idea. Our report really focused just on what we found about teacher evaluations. And finally, it was based on publicly available documents and cannot capture the on-the-ground realities that some of our discussants who are following me can speak to. So we're very happy that they're here to add that perspective. In terms of directions for future research, as we've said, it's very interesting to think about how specific measures might capture specific knowledge and skills. We think that's something that's worth further investigation. More can be done to look at how the specific measures are employed, more detail about how are observations really employed, how do the use of student artifacts play into evaluations. More could be done. Specific information was requested about how are evaluators trained, how is scoring calibrated. That information is not included in the report because we couldn't find much information about that on the publicly available websites and in the documents we looked at, but we believe that that's something of great interest to the field. And finally, we are confident that there's much to be done in terms of looking at the fidelity of implementation. Again, we focus just on what we saw in publicly available documents and would love to know more about how this plays out on the ground at the state level and at the district level and in the school context. So there's much research that could be done to look at fidelity of implementation. I am finished with my piece of the presentation. I'd like to stop and see if there are any questions, and then we'll move on to our next presenter.
You know, I'll say, Karen, that we had a question about how Tennessee was using the work of standards in teacher evaluation. And so at the time of this report, although Tennessee had the capacity to use these value-added models, they weren't actually required as part of the teacher evaluation systems. And so you will see that reflected in the report. Since the report has been published, so in this current school year, the value-added models are now required a percentage of the teacher evaluation. for each for teachers. So there's an answer, a little bit of a longer answer to a question that appeared. I tried to answer quickly via the chat. And yes, Karen is writing not to be shy. So yes, please don't. Any questions about the study itself or the findings? Feel free. We have a couple folks who look like they're typing something in, so that's great. We have a few minutes for questions.
There was a question about the Intasc standards. It was interesting for us that when we embarked on the study initially, we used the old Intasc standards for an initial round of coding, and then the new Intasc standards came out. And it's very interesting to look at the difference from the old to the new Intasc standards. They certainly reflect some changes. One of the key changes from the old to the new Intasc standards is that the 1992 ones were focused really on beginning teachers, and the new Intasc standards were designed to capture sort of the whole career continuum. And to use the new standards, there was a great deal in the new standards that reflect new directions that teaching standards are taking. And it's certainly, someone had asked to look at them, it's certainly worth a look and reading a little bit about the process of developing them.
Great. It looks like we have a question about whether or not these states have added rating scales since the report. We have not, other than following these states anecdotally through the news, we haven't done a systematic scan of these states as a follow-up. But as Karen mentioned earlier in the presentation, this was, these are sort of this is a pivotal time for teacher evaluation, and many of the changes that teacher evaluation systems have been implemented as a result of a push for Race to the Top funding, and it caused legislative changes in the kinds of features and what is required of teachers in evaluation systems. So I think it'd be a great sort of follow-on study to sort of check back a year later and see how much further states have proceeded. Looks like we have a couple other questions.
It's also going to be good to hear from Martha Ann Todd and Carla Bear. I believe they will each speak at some point about how they are employing rating categories, how they use them. So we hope that we can turn that question to them as well and hear a little bit from at least a few states. We should probably, let me see if there's maybe one more question, and then we should probably move on so we can hear from other folks. Julie, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I see a question about value-added measures and the sort of reliability and validity, and this, of course, is of great concern and debate now. And I think that there is a push among states, at least to what we see in the report, and then in sort of following these states beyond the report, that the value-added measures are only one component of the of the student assessment piece, and I think that's the direction state will go, as it's difficult to establish the the certain reliability and validity of the value-added models. So thanks for that. That's something that we hear that is heard often in this debate. Okay, so I think we want to keep to our time. We'll continue to answer some questions through chat. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Angela Micini, the Deputy Director of National Comprehensive Center for Teacher Quality, who'll speak for a few minutes about the challenges and opportunities around educator effectiveness from the national perspective. Okay, let me just push us forward. Great. Go ahead.
Sorry. Good afternoon. This is Angela Minici, and I'm the Deputy Director at the National Comprehensive Center for Teacher Quality. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk a little bit about what we see happening around the country regarding educator effectiveness. I thought I'd start off just by telling you a little bit about the National Comprehensive Center. We are a federally funded partnership, and our mission is to really help carry out the teacher quality initiatives of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, formerly known as No Child Left Behind. We're also a partnership of the American Institutes for Research, the Educational Testing Service, and Vanderbilt University. And our focus is really on providing technical assistance to both state education agencies as well as regional comprehensive centers. So we provide on-the-ground technical assistance as well as lots of research, some of which has been talked about earlier in this presentation. So I was really asked to talk about nationally what are some of the challenges and opportunities that we see around educator effectiveness. And so for just a couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about some of the big ones, and just to kind of let you know, we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I tried to maybe pick some of the ones that would be most relevant to the participants on this webinar. So the first one I want to really talk about is the issue of student achievement, the use of student achievement in teacher evaluation systems. And I noticed that we had a couple questions in the chat about that already. And I'll talk about it in two ways. The first way really is that there's the general concern over teacher attribution overall and the challenge that it presents. So we know that we have current tests that aren't validated for teacher effectiveness. And right now, states and districts are trying to figure out what's the best way to use student achievement or student outcomes so that the goal is really to improve teaching and learning. So I think that's the biggest issue and challenge kind of overall with the use of student achievement. We have lots of states and districts right now that are trying to figure out things like what's the right weight? What's the right way to incorporate this into an evaluation system? Again, with the ultimate goal being on improving teaching and learning. Should it be a weighted system? Should it not have a weight at all? Should we use a matrix approach? I think that these are questions that we don't have answers to right now. The opportunity for us right now, though, is because we do have so many different states and districts really focusing on this. And we have, for the ESEA flexibility waivers, we have the requirement of piloting. We should be getting a lot of good data that's going to hopefully help drive better decisions around these kinds of choices in the future. So that's really an opportunity. The second area for student achievement is really about the non-tested areas. And I think that this is probably the place that most states nationally are really struggling with. How do we incorporate measures of growth? What are valid and reliable measures that we can use in an evaluation system for all of our non-tested areas and for the majority of our teachers? The trend that we see right now in the field is that most states and districts are moving towards student learning objectives, and student learning objectives can be used really for any subject area and any grade, including your performance areas, your arts-based areas, and things like physical education as well. The opportunity around that is student learning objectives have the great potential that's very closely associated to what teachers are doing. But it's also a challenge as well, because to actually implement student learning objectives well, there's some capacity issues around that. And as I continue to talk here, I think you'll see that capacity is probably a common theme that really runs through most of these challenges. The second kind of challenge that nationally that we're seeing out there is really around principal evaluation. And mostly because most states have really chosen to tackle teacher evaluation first, while many states in their Race to the Top applications or in their ESEA waiver flexibility applications many of them haven't really begun to tackle that until now. The exception, one of the exceptions out there is Colorado, which decided to actually develop and pilot its administrator evaluation system first. And they're currently receiving some early data from their piloting of that system. So it's a state to look to see how they're doing and to get some good data back from them as well. And the other challenge with that is that we really have even less research on this particular area than we did in teacher evaluation. So as states begin to develop and design and pilot these systems, again, hoping the opportunity is that we hope that we'll get really good data and information about which systems are best. The third challenge that I wanted to discuss here today was really the role of the state education agency in ensuring quality educator evaluation systems. So right now, we see states, if we think about it in general terms, we see states really taking three kinds of approaches to designing and implementing evaluation systems. The first one I'll talk about is really the state-level evaluation system. So this is where the state provides strict interpretation of federal and state legislation, and they really are very prescriptive about the requirements of the teacher evaluation model. In a second kind of approach that state education agencies are taking nationally is what we would call an elective state-level evaluation system. So the state will strictly interpret some aspects of federal and state legislation, but also allows some flexibility in other aspects. They may mandate, for example, the use of student growth measures or models and weights, while leaving things like observation protocols or additional measures up to local school districts. And the third kind of approach is the district evaluation system with required parameters. And so here the state provides guidance to districts and plays only a small role in design and implementation of the evaluation system at the local level. Guidance might be general, and it may require its local school districts to include some components, but will really allow kind of a wide latitude to local school districts around designing their systems. The reason I mentioned the kinds of different approaches that states are taking to their educator evaluation systems because they really represent challenges around the state's role in ensuring this quality systems. So, for example, in the ESEA waiver application that many states applied for in Round 1 and Round 2, one of the requirements was really to ensure that its local school districts had high-quality systems that would improve teaching and learning, and that the state would in some way monitor the quality of those systems and implementation. And so I think that this is clearly one of the bigger challenges out there for state education agencies, particularly around the monitoring of the fidelity of implementation. And the state is also for the state to think about, given the different kinds of needs and particularly around capacity issues for local school districts, how does the SEA then leverage its capacity to really support its local school districts to be successful? So one of the things, I'll very quickly kind of give an example around, because I know that it was mentioned earlier in the presentation, is really around something around the training of evaluators. So many states are thinking about what role should the SEA play in this. Local districts are also struggling with this as well, because one of the theories of action behind why it's important to have an educator effectiveness system in a local district is that it's actually a lever for student improvement. So if we believe that educator evaluation systems can actually improve teaching and learning, then the individuals who do the evaluation systems themselves, first of all, have to be able to accurately assess teacher performance. They have to be able to effectively communicate the results of that evaluation to teachers, as well as to help teachers plan professionally. And so states and districts are really thinking about, how do we train people to ensure that they can do these three very particular things? Because if we don't have people who can accurately assess teacher performance, then you can see where the logic of teacher evaluation as a lever for improving student achievement would fall down. So I think this is, again, a great challenge in the field. It's also a great opportunity for us to really focus on bringing evaluation systems that can improve teaching and learning in the field. But I think it's clearly one of the areas that states are struggling with in terms of thinking about, what does statewide rollout look like? How do we really assist our districts in implementing these systems with high quality? And then more importantly, how do we ensure that local school districts continue to sustain the quality of these systems? And the final challenge that I really wanted to touch base with today is really the issue of coherence and cohesion. So how are all of these new proposed reforms actually working together? So for example, in the ESEA waiver applications that states were asked to submit, there were three major principles that they requested flexibility on. The first was college and career readiness. The second was on school accountability and school improvement, and the third was on educator effectiveness. And I think a challenge that's out there right now, whether it's at the state or local level, is how do all these systems work together? So what students need to know and be able to do is intricately related to what teachers need to know and be able to do. And when we think about school improvement, there's definitely a role for college and career readiness and for educator effectiveness. And I think, again, this is an area that is a struggle in thinking about how do these systems actually support one another. So again, that the goal is for higher student achievement. So the last thing I wanted to leave you with was an example of some of the tools that you might find on our website. And on the next slide, you'll have an actual link to the website, but there's a link to this a database on state teacher evaluation policies as well. So if you're interested in finding out more about what other states are doing that was very related to what you found out in the report here, you can go to our website, and to promote information sharing and collaboration as states and districts engage in this work, we created what we call the STEP database, and it's a database on state teacher and evaluation policies. We collect information on state-level teacher evaluation policies across multiple states, and then we organize the information under 8 key components, and you can see those components on the left-hand side of your screen of a comprehensive teacher evaluation system. So if you go to the website, it will actually allow you to compare information across all 8 of these components, and you can see many of these components are the same ones that the authors of this study specifically looked at in 5 states. You can choose, you can look across at least 3 states at a time, or you can compare multiple states on a single topic of your choosing to really see how are other states addressing some of these critical issues for teacher evaluation as well. And so with that, I'd like to end here. I know we have I think we have a poll and an opportunity for some questions and answers about the national perspective.
Great. Thanks so much, Angela. That was fantastic. Okay, let's just take a few questions here, observations. We already have one in the chat room from Mary Beal about the weighting of student achievement as a measure, which is very difficult in the special education classroom. So that's to the point about attributing student achievement to teachers in the non-tested grades and subjects. So that's one. I see folks are typing. Let's see, another, I thought, point or challenge of interest was the role of the SEA in ensuring quality educator evaluation systems. In our report, we focused at the state level, so we're looking at state-level frameworks or guidelines. But one of the things that became clear as we did this document review and then followed up with state folks as necessary is that the implementation of these systems does fall on the districts, the local education agencies, and there is much of the work is in the details of implementing this, including the training of evaluators, which is a time-consuming and labor-intensive activity. Okay, let's see. It looks like there's another. Okay.
Yeah. So I think that. So I think this is a question from Carol about sharing some promising state practices for supporting high-quality evaluator training. I think that there are several ways that states are approaching this. I think the most promising practices that we're seeing out there regarding really ensuring that the individuals who carry out these evaluations are going to be properly trained to do that are states that are actually requiring a certification component to it. And certification, some states don't call it that, but really it's a performance-based assessment, performance-based assessment for evaluation. So you have to have some way to ensure that after evaluators go through training, and I think that in the report you saw that evaluators may not necessarily be an administrator, it may be a teacher leader or a peer, but evaluators go through a training and you have some way to assess their ability to accurately assess teacher performance. That's the first part of it, so an initial kind of certification or assessment process. The second part of really a high-quality certification process or evaluator training program really then also includes a way to continuously calibrate an individual's skills. So we know that once people are trained, they go out into the field. They need lots of opportunities for practice, but they also need to make sure that their skills aren't what we call drifting, that they aren't actually kind of going back to their old ways of evaluating. So I think it's really two components to some of the promising practices that we see out there. One is an initial performance assessment of their skills, but then it's constantly assessing their skills when they're out there in the field.
That's great. Thanks, Angela, for the response. I see another question in the chat, which is a question about whether or not there's any research to help understand how many observations are important to conduct for each teacher each year. And that's a great question. And I don't think there is an adequate research base on that. And I'm sure that as these teacher evaluation systems start to become evaluated themselves, that there will be some research done about a sort of a maximum or
well, we have one study that's recently out, the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching study, that actually suggests that a minimum of 4 observations is necessary. But the good news to that, because I know some people are probably thinking that's a lot of observations, the good news part to that is that it may not be 4-hour-long observations. So what the current research, and I think it's completely accurate to say it's very early on in this research, but what the current research is saying is that more observations, maybe shorter time, is better than fewer observations at longer lengths. So right now that very early research from the Measures of Effective Teaching Practice is suggesting at least 4 classroom observations to make sure that you in effect are having you have a valid evaluation.
That's great. So this is Julie again. There was one comment in here from Mary about the, here we go, how are administrators going to handle all of the record keeping that goes along with these observations? That's a great that we've talked with at district level through our REL work, that that it will be challenging to not only keep record of it, but actually to complete the number of observations that will be required of each teacher now, so that will be difficult. I wanted to just also ask Amir if there's anything else you wanted to say about the special education, just sort of the particular challenges to including measures of student achievement for special ed teachers. And I think we will.
Well, I think, so to Mary's question about the administrators, I think that the other presenters on this webinar will actually be able to talk more about that. I think it's a great question for our friends in Georgia and Massachusetts. As far as and probably the special education that they can talk about as well, I think that for many of our teachers, the excuse me, the challenge of attributing growth to teachers is certainly, it's a huge challenge right now. And I think, again, what we're trying to find in the field is really good data to help to really help drive our decisions on that. So many places are looking at student learning objectives as an approach to an effective approach for dealing with special educators. I think that it's fair to say the jury's really out on that, and we need much better data in order to make those kinds of decisions.
Well, I see that the chat is really picking up here, and I hesitate to, stop, but I think I want to keep us on time. So we'll push out some more answers and responses through the chat, and I will pause here for just a general poll for the group about what evaluation measures you think are the most difficult to implement. And so this is related to really this conversation we've had in presentations and in the chat. So take a moment to vote in the poll, which will appear on your screen. I think we're waiting for the poll. So you can be thinking and reflecting on what you think just from your context, from where you are in the schools or states or districts. Okay, and take a moment to vote, cast your poll. Looks to me like analysis, let's see, evaluated models again, student ratings of teacher performance, yes, and and some early work being done in that through the MET project, yes, and professional growth plans is another, and perhaps a little bit in analysis of teaching portfolios and analysis of classroom artifacts, both of which we don't see or we didn't see integrated as much in the teacher evaluation systems featured in the report that Karen reviewed. Okay, so this is interesting. The evaluated models, again, really look like they're most difficult. I mean, there are statistical models that you then have to figure out the weighting of. So it clearly seems like, at least for this group, and nationally, looks like it is. Looks like it's viewed as one of the more difficult features to implement. Okay, well let's close the poll. It looks like many of you have voted, and move to our next spot on the agenda. So we'll hear voices from the field. I'm going to introduce Martha Ann Todd first, who is the Director of Teacher and Leader Effectiveness, and she'll talk a bit about what Georgia has been doing since our report. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Martha Ann, if you are online and able to start.
Good afternoon. This is Martha Ann. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you a little bit about the work we're doing in Georgia. I would like to say there have been quite a few changes in the work since the report was researched and written. This year we have been involved in the pilot of a restructured teacher evaluation system based on the class key system that was reported in the document that you have available to you through the electronic platform here. Our pilot has been based on the understanding that we will eventually move to statewide rollout. Georgia has a legal requirement for annual evaluation of every teacher. It has several specific requirements of that evaluation system in the law, but not a specific evaluation system named, not an instrument named. We're working, though, as a function of our Race to the Top work and as also a function of our waiver for what we have been calling adequate yearly progress calculations to develop and implement and roll out this evaluation system that we're now calling the Teacher Keys Evaluation System statewide by 2014-15. The system is in its redesigned version, designed for teachers who are providing direct instruction. Some of the topics that I was asked to address are multiple measures, and so we'll start with that. The system is designed as a separate source from observation, but the system has standards-based rubrics, 10 performance standards for teachers. The domains for those standards are 5. There's one on planning, there's a domain on instructional delivery, a domain of assessment of and for learning, a domain for learning environment, and a domain for professionalism and communication. There are 2 standards in each of those domains. Those standards and classroom practice, professional practice around those standards are assessed by observations using rubrics and by the analysis of documentation when needed to support the observation. Following our pilot, as we get ready for implementation for next year, we're planning to look at 2 observations in the formative process, 30 minutes each, as well as 4 walkthroughs, 10 to 15 minutes each, conducted throughout the year to provide information around that professional practice. We will also collect information from surveys of students on their experiences in teacher practice in the classroom. Our original plan in the Race to the Top grant was to count that as a separate percent or weight in the measure of teacher effectiveness that will be calculated at the end of the year summative evaluation time. We're working now with USDOE to move the student survey data, the perception data, into the standards area of the teacher evaluation system so that the survey response data becomes part of your documentation for your rating of those 10 standards on the rubrics of professional practice. We will also have measures of student growth, not academic achievement as we're accustomed to calculating it for purposes of AYP, for example, but student growth. In other words, we're focusing on, are we getting a year's worth of growth for a year's worth of instruction? We have 2 types of measures in that category. One is a student growth percentile measure that is based on our state assessments for certain grades and subjects. And then for the non-tested grades and subjects that we don't have state assessments for, we're working on district-determined student learning objectives. That's a little different approach to student learning objectives from most states, but we're actually pulling together groups of district personnel, including classroom teachers, using district-level data to set the growth target for the student learning objectives, and then student growth and those measures become part of the teacher effectiveness measure calculation for teachers in the non-tested subjects and grades. So our multiple measures include evaluation based on observation, documentation, And we hope eventually the perception data on those 10 standards and rubrics, and then student growth performance on either the student growth percentile measures or student learning objective measures. We have worked on numbers of observations, practicality, realistic expectations for principles in implementation this year, and we've come to the conclusion that next year when we go forward with implementation, we'll have those 2 30-minute observations and the 4 walkthrough type observations that will be 10 to 15 minutes. Just a note, our performance standards have been crosswalked with the Intasc standards and are aligned with those standards at this point. We will, on our rubrics, have multiple rating categories. In the class keys system that is documented in the report, the ratings on the rubrics were exemplary, proficient, emerging, and not evident. In our restructuring work from the class keys to the teacher keys system we're working with now, we've gone to exemplary, proficient, developing / needs improvement, and ineffective. So our teachers will be rated across those 4 categories, both in the performance standards work, that is one of the components, but also in the overall teacher effectiveness measure that will be produced at the end of the year as a part of the annual evaluation. They will be rated across those 4 categories. The relationship between the teaching standards and the evaluation, I think I've really already highlighted. Our teaching standards do drive the observation, the documentation, and they're also directly linked to all of the survey items in our student perception surveys. The idea behind the selection of those 10 standards, we moved from 26 in class keys to these 10, was to select the 10 that have the greatest potential to have positive impact on student learning in the classroom, and that has been our focus. We're really working to build a system that provides an opportunity for teachers to demonstrate their best practice over time, to demonstrate their ability to impact student learning, and will allow us to provide professional learning opportunities, growth opportunities, and coaching for teachers who are needing to improve in certain areas of those standards or overall. We expect that the type of teaching standards that will be hardest to capture through the actual observation and documentation piece will be professional. To structure some templates and some specific guidance around documentation that would be appropriate for that. Evaluator training has been mentioned. We're working on an evaluator certification process for our implementation year next year, which will be similar to the process that was used with class keys for evaluator training. It will involve some sort of written assessment for evaluators who have been trained, as well as some performance assessment based on ratings using the rubrics and video selections that will be standardized for the evaluator certification process. We're also in the process of developing an electronic platform to support our districts in the implementation of this system. The electronic platform will allow our districts to conduct observations electronically, to upload documentation as needed, to conduct the surveys and roll in that data into the system, as well as we'll do the calculations and provide ongoing data reports to our districts. That has been very clear to us as we've piloted this year, that we need a system that really addresses teacher performance in a way that will help us move the level of quality forward and higher, but will also be practical and realistically manageable, and that principals and districts can implement with fidelity, as opposed to having something that's so overwhelming they just wind up checking it off and saying, okay, we did that. We really want a system that will performance and thus on student learning. I think that's very close to the end of my time, so I'll pause and see if there are questions.
Thank you so much, Ann. It's actually really interesting to hear the work that has progressed since the report has been published, in particular the work around the perceptions and even the alignment of the Intasc Standards, and just sort of the sort of implementation or the training of the evaluators and that kind of thing. I think what we may do is just hold questions till we get to the end of the next presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions for all the panelists on the panel here so we can get through in time. So I'm going to advance the slide one, so we get to Carla Brooks-Bear, who is a retired Deputy Commissioner and a consultant now for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and she will give a similar view of what's going on in Massachusetts these days with regard to teacher evaluation. So Carla, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, and hello to the folks on the line. I've as you mentioned, I retired last summer just after the Board of Education in Massachusetts adopted new regulations for educator evaluation. The regulations apply to superintendents, principals, and teachers. And so we're actually implementing all three simultaneously, starting with selected districts this year so that we're getting some of the bugs worked out of the system, and then in all of our Race to the Top districts starting next year. I've stayed on through this year to ensure that launch, and I'll be finishing up with guidance that we'll be providing to all of our districts about how to handle this issue of assessing student growth. So I'll talk a little bit about that in the presentation. The slide in front of you is the description of the five-step evaluation cycle that is at the core of our system. So it's got some features of the Georgia system. Our system actually makes use of all of the sources of evidence that were talked about in the report. Although not explicitly the teaching portfolio, although there are some aspects of a portfolio even built into this. So, that the five-step process starts with self-assessment on the top, where every educator, and think now this applies to superintendents, it applies to principals, and it applies to classroom teachers, but we'll speak specifically about teachers here. So every teacher uses a rubric and data about student learning in their self-assessment. The rubric is built off of 4 standards. In the report it would call them domains. 4 standards that were developed with the help of a task force that met over a period of about 8 months to identify 4 standards, 16 indicators, which the report would call standards. Georgia might call those standards. So 16 standards and 33 elements. There's more emphasis in our system on family and community engagement. That's actually one of the 4 domains is family and community engagement. A second is curriculum planning and assessment. A third is teaching all students. And the fourth is what we call professional culture. One of the standards is 2 of the standards are more important than the others. That is, a teacher cannot get an overall rating of proficient unless they've earned a rating on the standard for curriculum planning and assessment and also on the standard for teaching all students of proficient. So 2 of the standards are deemed more important than the others. So these standards and indicators are translated to a rubric that describes performance at 4 levels of exemplary performance, proficient performance, needs improvement, and unsatisfactory. And the teacher uses that rubric as well as data about past students and data about the students that she or he has in front of her this year to undergo a self-assessment. At the second stage, every educator proposes at least 1 professional practice goal, a goal for improving their own professional practice, and 1 student learning goal. And in our system, team goals must be considered. That's actually a requirement to try to promote the kind of collaboration that we think is central to educator growth and development. At the third step, once the goals have been translated into a plan that's approved by the evaluator, in most cases the principal, then the educator and evaluator both collect evidence along the way to assess progress moving forward in implementing that plan. At the fourth step, every educator has a mid-cycle review focusing on how they're doing on their goals and what the data from observations and looking at artifacts tells them about how the educator is doing. And then at the fifth step, the educator earns one of the 4 ratings based on performance against the standards and then also progress on goals. So the summative performance rating, one of 4 ratings, is based on the performance on each of the 4 standards plus the attainment of their goals. At least one goal, as I said, on professional practice, one goal on student learning. So to arrive at that summative rating, which is the gray box to the slight right on this chart, the left are the sources of evidence. There are products of practice, for example, observations, artifacts of teaching, etc. The middle are multiple measures of student learning. And the third, other evidence. And other evidence can really be anything. But one of the things that it will include, starting in the 13-14 school year, is student data from students. And the department, under the regulations, has the responsibility by a year from now, providing direction to the districts about how best to collect and analyze and use student feedback in the evaluation process for teachers, for principals, and for superintendents. In the case of administrators, you might be interested, the regulations also require the use of data from staff. That data is filtered through a rubric to derive ratings on each of the 4 standards and filtered through to determine attainment of the goals, their practice goals and their student learning goals. So that's how the summative rating is done. Our system does not put an arithmetic formula to translate ratings on the standards and the goals into the single overall rating. We really are deferring to professional judgment at this point. So that's the summative rating, which is the phase 1 of our process. So you can see here, this is another way to display it. The summative rating of one of the 4 ratings determines the length and intensity of the growth plan that the educator is on. So exemplary and proficient educators are on a 2-year self-directed growth plan. Educators identified as needing improvement go on a plan of 1 year or less of a directed growth plan. And an educator identified as unsatisfactory goes on an improvement plan that could be as short as 30 days in really serious cases. But phase 2, which we will be implementing over the next several years, every educator earns a second rating, and that's captured here on the bottom horizontal, where there's a rating of impact on student learning. So this is how we're tackling the value-added piece. In addition to the goal setting in phase 1, there's this separate rating. And as the note here says, it's based on multiple measures of performance, including the MCAS student growth percentile. That's our state test, our growth percentile that comes from it. It's not basic achievement. It's growth in a year. And MEPA is our English proficiency assessment. So those have to be included, but it cannot be only those measures. So this measure of rating of impact on student learning is based on trends, which for us means at least 2 years of data, and patterns, which for us means at least 2 separate measures of student growth. And then on the state measures when they're available, and the district-determined measures of student learning. That rating of impact on student learning, we have a certain humility at this point about how much you can count that until we really understand reliability, validity, and a host of issues about this. And that is that, so you can see the impact comes in 2 ways on the plans. An educator rated exemplary or proficient, but whose rating of impact on student learning is low, does not get the right to a 2-year self-directed growth plan. They have to do a 1-year self-directed growth plan where the focus is on unpacking why that discrepancy. Similarly, in the blue band up above, educators rated exemplary, whose impact on student learning is rated as moderate or high, need to be recognized in some way. It can range from extra compensation to public recognition at a school committee or school board meeting. But there needs to be recognition of educators based on those ratings. So that's the core of how our system is working. We're in the process now of working with districts and internally and looking at the research and what other districts are doing to provide guidance to districts that will be available in June this year to guide them in how to think about and identify the district-determined measures of student learning gains. We see this as an opportunity to expand the palette of assessments that are used, particularly in non-tested areas, but not exclusively in non-tested areas. Only 17% of our educators have student growth scores on our state exam that could be used, so we have many more educators in non-tested grades and subjects. We want to take this as an opportunity to really develop the assessment literacy of educators in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and to broaden the range of assessments. So as another option, we're looking at portfolio assessment as well as traditional assessment, and we're in the process of developing that guidance. We also will be working with districts next year in identifying some models that can be used statewide. So we're very concerned about district capacity. Districts are looking to us to work with teachers and others in the state to draw on the best of the research to identify strong assessment models that can be used in the districts across the state. So let me stop there. I'm sure there's plenty more that people have questions about.
Okay, thanks so much, Carla. That's great. You know, when we were planning this webinar, you know, we wanted to marry the report with, you know, these voices from the field and you know, get a national perspective as well. And I'm so glad that we did, because we can see by hearing from all these folks that the work of teacher evaluation is a very complex process with multiple dimensions, and so it's been interesting to hear specifically how that is being operationalized. So before we move on to questions and answers, I just want to thank the folks who joined us here today, Angela Minichi, Martha Ann Todd, and Carla Brooks-Bear, for their time and in sharing you know, their perspective from their national and state context. So we don't have much time left, but we have some time for a couple of questions. I'm going to open it up for all the panelists. So if you have a question for anyone in particular, probably is helpful if you just preface your question with the name. If you have a question about the report, you could ask Karen or myself, Julie Reardon, and we'll have a couple of minutes for questions, and then we'll close it out on time. I see that there has already been some back and forth between some of our panelists and the participants, which is great. Yep. What?
The issue of professional development, and I believe somebody else asked, you know, how are we, you know, what do we see out there in the field regarding professional development? And I'll make, excuse me, I'll make my comment brief, and then maybe Carla or Martha Ann can jump in and talk about how they're thinking about it in their states. But I think that this is clearly, again, it's clearly a challenge in the field because we know that in order for educator evaluation to really work, it has to be about more than sorting and identifying teachers on a continuum performance. So I think that in places like we just heard Carla talk about in Massachusetts, it's looking at how professional development plans can really help educators use that evaluation data and improve. So I think that there are different ways that states are trying to approach this, and at the district level too. But I know, at least in thinking about the work that I'm doing out there in the field at both the state and local level, I think we really need to start to rethink how we've delivered professional development in the past, and that hasn't been a very effective way. And that school districts really need to think about how do they support high-quality instruction in every classroom. And when we start to think about that, to really meet that goal, and how do we harness evaluation data for that purpose? So it's probably not an answer to that question, but I think it's really it's at the crux of the educator evaluation system that we really figure out how we deliver professional development that's job embedded, that's linked to the Common Core state standards or college and career ready standards, and really uses that evaluation data. So with that, I'll stop because Carla
let me
may want to jump in there and talk about that as well.
If I could build a little bit on that. This is Carla Baer again from Massachusetts. We've been thinking long and hard about this, and we couldn't agree more that we need to support the building of district capacity to provide professional development in a more systemic and job-embedded way. So we're in the process of working with several of our vendors that are out there working in districts anyway, knitting them into a network of providers who are very well informed of the new system, and we meet with them regularly. And we're developing the modules that can be used by school leadership teams across the and we're also producing a variety of guides that really push this issue of schools and districts needing to organize so that there is time and space within the school calendar for teachers to collaborate and to use that collaboration time on the self-assessment work, the data analysis work, the goal-setting work, and the monitoring, the self-monitoring of the goals that is so central to our system. We know we can expand that with collaborative work on designing assessments that measure what most matters in the content that teachers are teaching. And our effort is built around building the capacity of higher education and the traditional vendors to develop a shared vocabulary, a shared understanding, and a common approach to providing professional development and support for districts and schools.
Great, thanks. And Martha Ann, do you want to add anything there?
In Georgia, we're taking an approach that will help, we hope, differentiate professional development so that it can actually be focused to the classroom level, so that every teacher in the building does not have to receive the same professional learning if that's not what the performance indicates is needed. We are working to develop a number of professional development modules related to our performance standards on the state level, which we will make available to the districts. We're also working to build the capacity within our electronic platform so that districts can link through the electronic platform any professional development that they might have purchased from another vendor or have created themselves and link with the standards for the uses in their own districts, not to be shared statewide.
Great, thanks. I see with an eye to the time, I think we should probably bring this to a close. I wanted to, again, thank all of our panelists and participants for joining us today. There is going to be a customer satisfaction survey which will follow this presentation, and we really value your feedback. This is our first event, as Susan mentioned, of the first webinar event that we've had, so your feedback is valuable to us. I will turn it over to you, Susan, to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Julie, and thank you to our presenters, especially bringing that really feet on the ground insight from your work as it's unfolding. I think that is clearly what we, as part of our work with the new Research Alliance that I described at the beginning of this session, that we're hoping to be able to bring the news about action and developments as it is happening really to all of you, and so that it can continue to inform all of our practices and our work in this area. I'd like to point out some additional resources. We cited several throughout this presentation, but there are some tremendous resources also on the Assessment and Accountability Comprehensive Center site, on selecting teacher measures, and additional resources on our What Works Clearinghouse, the Doing What Works website. If you're not familiar with these sites, you should be sure and go to them and look for some resources around this area. And of course, our co-sponsor of this webinar, the New England Comprehensive Center, they too have done a tremendous amount of work to position our states and districts to work in teacher evaluation. And they have resources there. And I'd like to remind all of you, if you are interested in becoming involved with our Northeast Educator Effectiveness Research Alliance, to please contact me or Karen Shakman. I am the lead facilitator, and Karen is our lead researcher on that initiative. And as I've mentioned, we are just formulating that group, and we invite you to join with us. And if you have general information you would like on the Regional Education Laboratory, please feel free to contact our director or deputy director. Once again, I would like to ask all of you to please complete our short customer satisfaction survey that will pop up at the end of this session. And I thank all of you again for the tremendous information for today. We look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you.